Today, in our first session on Romanticism, we'll be talking about the historical background of the Romantic movement. While doing so, we'll be covering four aspects: the political history, which is all the revolutions which happened during this period, the cultural history of the Romantic movement, that is, the early influential writers and their works, as well as the German roots of Romanticism. Thirdly, we'll be talking about the etymology of Romanticism, that is, the terms romance, romantic, and romanticism, the history of these words. Finally, we'll be talking about the when, where, and what of the Romantic Revolution, which is the period of the Romantic Revolution, national specificity, and how would we define the term Romantic Revolution. So let's start with the political history. Now, why is the period from late 18th to mid 19th century called the Age of Revolutions? We all know that during the Augustan Age, British society attained a high level of political and social stability. However, this stability did not last for long. The American Declaration of Independence from the British rule of 1776 saw George Washington become the first president of the USA. The Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, stated that America was an independent nation and that its inhabitants had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As a result of the American War of Independence, the loss of American colonies began at a time when Britain's conservative rulers feared the general forces of revolutionary furore and were determined to prevent these forces from spreading to British society. This is why the said period, this period when a number of revolutions arose in most of Europe and the Americas, is often referred to as the Age of Revolutions. Now we shall discuss the Industrial Revolution, which completely transformed Britain's social structure, and also the French Revolution, and how both these revolutions brought new ideas and beliefs. We will be seeing how both these revolutions had a deep influence on all aspects of British culture and literature. Now, what was the Industrial Revolution about? The term Industrial Revolution generally refers to England's economic development from 1760 to the middle of the 19th century. Now, it is a process that is perhaps difficult to date very precisely, but it is certainly one that rapidly transformed Britain from an agricultural to an industrial country. The Industrial Revolution involved the use of new sources of power like coal and the steam engine. Now, because of which transportation and communication improved. Also, technological invention reached its climax in this period with the Great Exhibition of 1851, which exhibited new inventions of science and technology from all across the world. Now, if you are interested in an insightful study of how this exhibition established England's role as an industrial leader, you can see Mark Shelansky's Civilization in the West. It was published by Pearson Publications in 2008. Now, what were some of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution? During the Industrial Revolution, power and wealth began to move from the land-owning aristocracy to factory owners and other employers based in the cities. In this period, cities expanded rapidly thanks to the influx of rural farm workers who became industrial laborers. The old feudal structure of agrarian society was demolished, monarchy was abolished, to give way to a new social order, a nation divided between rich landowners and industrialists on the one hand, and the restless urban poor on the other. The new urban masses lived in conditions of not just terrible poverty and overcrowding, but also the atmosphere was polluted by smoke from factories. If the living conditions of the uneducated workers were unhygienic, then the moral fabric of the society too became one that was dominated by the values of deceit, greed, and hypocrisy. These were aspects which spoiled the hitherto polite character of English society. The invention of the steam engine led to an emphasis on travel, which in turn encouraged people to venture into new territories, both literally and metaphorically. and the world came to be seen as an infinite place with an infinite potential. So these were some of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. Now let's talk about the French Revolution. We must keep in mind that after its initial gesture of the elimination of aristocracy, the French Revolution developed into a bloody power struggle between different groups. The Jacobins, who seized power from the moderate middle class Grindons in 1793, used extreme measures to realize their revolutionary aims. Led by Maximilien Robespierre, they mobilized a huge army and radicalized the French Constitution, introducing the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. In theory, if not in practice, the first genuinely democratic constitution to be proclaimed by a democratic state. Now let's come to the Napoleonic Wars. However, at the same time, their idea of justice for all also meant the execution of large numbers of traitors to the revolution. This was called the justice of the guillotine, and the guillotine was both a practical device for execution and a symbol of justice for the supporters of the French Revolution. Also, do remember that the masses had little chance to exercise their freedom. They were needed as soldiers to fight against France's now numerous enemies. Eventually, divided by external conflicts, the post-revolutionary government began to weaken. Thus, General Napoleon Bonaparte was able to seize power from the politicians and proclaim himself Emperor of France in 1804. Napoleon then led the French army in an unprecedented conquest of Europe. Now, during the Napoleonic Wars, that is 1800 to 15, Napoleon's navy was defeated by Britain in 1805 under the command of Admiral Nelson. It was Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia which led to defeat and his abdication in 1814. In 1815, he returned to France to declare himself emperor again, but was defeated at Waterloo by the Duke of Wellington. Now let's talk about radicalism in Britain. Radicalism in Britain, although influenced by the French Revolution, never extended to mass violent mutiny. It was instead restricted to protest movements and demands of electoral reform. During this period, it was largely due to the availability of simplified versions of Thomas Paine's radical Rights of Man, which was published in 1791, a work in which he defended the French Revolution against Edmund Burke's stance in Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in 1790. That radicalism in Britain began to spread across class boundaries and also through the popular press and broadside ballads. Now, for a comprehensive examination of Paine's writings and ideology, there's a book here that you can read, which is by Mark Phillips. There's also a link that I have enclosed. Now, when talking about radicalism, what first comes to mind are the Luddite riots of 1811-12. As the Industrial Revolution continued, workers were increasingly worried about the fact that the introduction of new machines was leading to heavy unemployment. This led to the Luddite riots, which took their name from Ned Ludd, a hero of the workers who had destroyed a power loom in protest. The Luddites started destroying machines in Nottingham and the movement spread throughout England. However, the movement was soon suppressed and the destruction of machines became punishable by death. Yet another event that comes to mind when talking about radicalism is the Peterloo Massacre of 1819. In this incident, approximately 60,000 people demonstrated in support of parliamentary reform and were violently dispersed by the army from St. Peter's Field in Manchester. 11 demonstrators were killed and the tragedy became known as Peterloo in ironic reference to the Battle of Waterloo, which the British government had represented as the defeat of French authoritarianism by Britain's free institutions. The event marked an important turning point in British parliamentary history and was an important incentive in the Whigs' move towards the Reform Parliament in 1832. Also, the period between 1811 and 1820 is known as the Regency. Why? Toward the end of his long reign, George III suffered from mental illness and power was given to his son, who became Prince Regent from 1811 to 1820. The Prince Regent became George IV at the death of his father in 1820 and reigned for 10 years. During his reign, trade unions were legalized and the prison system was reformed. In 1830, George IV was succeeded by William IV. His reign was a period of important reforms. In 1832, the first Reform Act was passed owing to a large Whig majority in the parliament. It extended the right to vote to middle class men who acquired more political power as a consequence. However, parliament was still largely controlled by the upper class landowners, and many of the new middle class parliamentarians served their interests. The French Revolution and the fears which surrounded it spread also to the regimes which governed Britain's growing number of colonies and which were becoming more authoritarian during this period. As a result, the first revolt took place in the Caribbean in 1801 in the French colony of Saint-Domingue under the revolutionary leader and former slave Toussaint Louverture. A considerable sum of money was spent trying to reconquer the colony and reimpose slavery there, as it was feared that rebellion would spread and damage industries and emerging consumer economy. Particularly, the consumption of tea and alcohol depended heavily on the use of slave labor in the colonies, and the authorities were quick to crush local resistance. Revolt was, however, encouraged by abolitionists and non-conformist ministers who were beginning to have a strong influence on slave populations, inspired by the theories of Thomas Paine and others regarding the notion of human rights. As news of slave massacres reached Britain, public opinion began to turn against slavery, particularly because slaves were increasingly seen not as savages but as persecuted fellow Christians. In 1833, slavery was finally made illegal, in large part owing to the campaign of philanthropist and politician William Wilberforce, who devoted much of his life to the cause. Now let's talk about some of the early influential writers. The first one is Thomas Clarkson. He was an English abolitionist and one of the earliest proponents of the English movement against slave trade and against slavery in the colonies. In 1785, he entered a Latin essay competition organized by Cambridge University. The topic of the essay was, "Is it lawful to make slaves of others against their will?" which he later published in pamphlet form as an essay on the slavery and commerce of the human species, particularly the African, in 1786. This essay brought him into association with William Wilberforce, we've just talked about him, and together they helped achieve the passage of the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which put an end to the British trade in slaves. Another influential writer and philosopher was Rousseau, who famously said, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." In 1749, this Swiss-born philosopher participated in an essay competition sponsored by the Academy of Dijon, in which the question was, "Has the restoration of the sciences and the arts contributed to the purification of morals?" His answer was later published in 1750 and is known as the First Discourse, or a discourse on the moral effects of arts and sciences. In 1754, he participated in yet another essay competition sponsored by the Academy of Dijon, in which the question was, "What is the origin of inequality among people and is it authorized by natural law?" His response was published as Second Discourse, or Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men, in 1755. Now, what were his answers? Rousseau challenged, attacked, and criticized the political commitment to scientific progress, which of course is a recurrent feature of most modern societies. He claimed that inequality was inadvertently the result of property ownership rights and the development of civil society, in which differences of rank, class become apparent. In contrast to the inequality of the present, Rousseau posited a state of nature, as you can see in the frontispiece of Discourse on Inequality. In the image here, Rousseau is leading us back to nature, a state of the self where man is not constrained by social forces. This is also where the idea of the noble savage originated, although the phrase is not Rousseau's but that of Dryden. Now, where did Dryden use it first? He says, I am as free as nature first made man, ere the base laws of servitude began. When wild in woods the noble savage ran. This is from the Conquest of Granada that was published in 1672, by Dryden. If man in the state of nature is one example of mankind uncorrupted by the divisive inequalities of social injustices, then the romantic child is the other, as described in Rousseau's book Emile, which was published in 1762. This text on childhood and education exerted immense influence on the Romantic movement. The world needed to be regenerated from its corrupt state. It therefore seemed inevitable to restart all over again with a childlike perspective, since children were uncorrupted, innocent, and so they also shared a special affinity with nature. One of the most prominent revolutionaries of the period was also Thomas Spence, who was perhaps the first in England to use the phrase rights of man in a lecture titled The Rights of Man that he delivered at the Philosophical Society, Newcastle upon Tyne on November 8, 1775. Even more notably, he was a proponent of children's rights and published The Rights of Infants in 1797. He believed that children should be free from abuse and poverty and have a basic right towards sustenance and protection, since they are inherently dependent on adults for their physical well-being. He believed that children's rights could be instated only through political change, which in turn could occur only through the abolition of public ownership of property and aristocracy, thereby putting an end to an unjust society. It will also give you a good overview of Thomas Spence's views on women. Yet another important figure during this period was John Oswald. He was a Scottish philosopher, poet, and social critic. Oswald, like Rousseau, held the view that modern society is in conflict with the true nature of man as being kind, compassionate, and sympathetic. He claimed that the division of labor in the act of butchering animals had lulled man's sensitivities. Oswald therefore espoused vegetarianism on behalf of persecuted animals, and he wrote a book, The Cry of Nature, in 1791, in which he spoke about the rights of animals. Now, yet another influential writer of the period was Mary Wollstonecraft, whose Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, is a seminal feminist work. As opposed to the traditional notion that women exist only to please men, Wollstonecraft proposed that women and men be given the same fundamental rights and equal opportunities in politics, work, as well as education. She posited that women are as naturally rational as men. If at all women are perceived as being frivolous, it is merely because society trains them to be seen and valued as irrelevant. She also argued that women are very important to society because they raise children on whom depends the future of the nation. Yet another important figure of the period was William Godwin, who was a political journalist and social philosopher. His An Enquiry Concerning Political Justice, which was published in 1793, is an important piece of work in which he proposed a radical theory of philosophical anarchism. Now, what was this theory? According to Godwin, institutions such as education, marriage, and the government itself construct the innately good nature of man. In place of these institutions, he proposed small self-subsisting communities. He argued that social institutions fail because they impose preconceived notions and generalized thought categories on man, which make it impossible for man to utilize the competence of reason and view things as they exist. In combining cultural determinism with a doctrine of extreme individualism, Godwin advocated the route to man's future perfectibility. Also, in doing so, Godwin provided the Romantics with the central idea that man, once released from the constraints of social and political forces, will be in perfect rational harmony with the universe. And it is in this natural state ultimately that man will be able to express himself better than he already is doing in his present state. Now let's come to the German roots of Romanticism. We'll be talking about the very famous Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He was a German poet, novelist, theatre director and critic who famously said that Romanticism is sickness, classicism is health. His reflection on subjectivity can be said to be the theme running unanimously through his varied and huge literary work. He shows how we create our own selves, the world that contains us, as well as the meaning and purpose of our lives. An early participant of the Sturm und Drang, that is storm and stress literary movement in Germany between the late 1760s and early 1780s was Goethe. Now what was this Sturm und Drang movement? It was a German literary movement of the late 18th century that exalted feeling, human individualism and nature. In doing so, it sought to overthrow the Enlightenment cult of rationalism. As we shall see in our next session on Romanticism, the cult of rationalism was eventually replaced by the cult of individualism once the Romantic writers entered the literary scene. While a student at Strasbourg, he met Johann Gottfried von Herder, who was staying at Strasbourg for an eye operation. Herder introduced Goethe to German folk songs, Gothic architecture and Shakespeare. Inspired by these ideas, Goethe began exploring literary possibilities with a new fervor. As a result, in 1773, he published a play based upon the 16th century German knight Gus von Berlichingen. In the same year, he also collaborated with Herder and others on the pamphlet One Deutsche Art und Kunst, which was a volume of essays on nature and art. This was a kind of manifesto of the Sturm und Drang movement. The notion of Sturm und Drang, that is storm and stress, was to be a component not just of Goethe's work but of the work of a whole range of artists, from Goethe to the painter Caspar David Friedrich to the composers Beethoven, Schubert and Schumann. Now, when we are talking of these music composers, of particular relevance to Romanticism were their song compositions called Lieder, which were German songs, and these German songs were characterized by an atmosphere of Sehnsucht, that is longing, pining or yearning, the desire for that which is distant and unattainable. Many of these Lieder were also the musical settings of the works of German Romantic poets. Now let's talk briefly about Jena Romanticism. Now three prominent figures of Jena Romanticism were Friedrich Schlegel, August Schlegel and Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Now Friedrich Schlegel was influenced by Fichte's transcendental philosophy. Fichte in turn was influenced by Immanuel Kant's doctrine of the inherent moral worth of man. Both Kant and Fichte stressed upon the subjective dimension of individualism in their works. Together with his brother, August Schlegel, Friedrich Schlegel started the periodical Athenaeum in 1798. This was published between 1798 to 1800. And this became the organ of Jena Romanticism. Jena Romanticism is a term that is used for the first phase of Romanticism in German literature, and this first phase was centered in Jena, and these writers, that is Fichte and the Schlegel brothers, were writing from Jena. Both Fichte and Novalis, there's another writer here, Novalis, who contributed to the Athenaeum. Now, who was Novalis? Now both Fichte and Novalis contributed to the Athenaeum. Now there's another thinker and author here called Novalis. Now who was Novalis? Now with Novalis we come to the etymology of romance, romantic and romanticism. Now it was the Germans who toward the end of the 18th century first used the word romantic in an entirely positive sense, extending it to denote a spiritual and aesthetic attitude. And it was the poet Novalis 1772 to 1801 who employed the term to describe the transformation of a common or vulgar object or situation into something highly meaningful, or the transformation of something known into something mysterious, the finite into the infinite. For Novalis, the word romantic became synonymous with poetic. Now his Fichte studies by Novalis of 1795-96 seeks to understand and elaborate upon the post-Kantian philosopher. Even though Novalis agrees that the I makes the known world, yet he also claims that this world is also a you, interacting with the self in mediations such as language. Notes entitled Poeticisms and Logological Fragments unravel this power of language and formulate central ideas of romanticism. Poesy is the basis of society, says Novalis. The world must be romanticized, says Novalis. Historically, this is the first use of the word romantic, and in its modern sense, it signifies a moral necessity to recreate society as an aesthetic construct. Following its use by Novalis, the simple word romantic came to stand for a whole movement of artists, writers, philosophers, and composers who were rebelling against classicism, a movement that quickly spread from Germany to the rest of Europe. Now, from where is the word romantic derived and what were its earliest implications? Even though the word romantic was first used by the Germans in a positive sense, we must also remember that it is derived from romance, French name for the chivalric tales that rose to popularity in the Middle Ages toward the middle of the 17th century. The word romantic was then used critically and pejoratively to describe the fantastic and unrealistic style of chivalric romances, which were identified as imaginary, frivolous, and trivial. From these Germanic and medieval roots, Romantic writers borrowed themes and motifs they found useful and desirable, such as the supernatural, the irrational, the ritualistic, and the wild and untamed. Now let's chart a trajectory of early examples of the use of the word romantic and romanticism. Now the word romantische poesie was already being used by the Schlegel brothers in sometime around the early 1790s. Then later in 1800, August Schlegel said the following: I seek and find the romantic among the older moderns in Shakespeare and Cervantes, in Italian poetry in that age of chivalry, love and fable, from which the phenomenon and the word itself are derived. This was in Dialogue on Poetry that was published in 1800. And of course, as I already said, that the Schlegel brothers, who were two of the founders of the NR Romanticism movement, were also using it while publishing their periodical, which is Athenaeum, in the 1790s. Now, after the Schlegel brothers, we have Madame Germaine de Stael, who used it in her De l'Allemagne in 1813. Then William Wordsworth in Preface to Lyrical Ballads in 1815, which is the second edition, spoke about the romantic harp and the classic lyre. Then Byron in 1820 said, I perceive that in Germany as well as in Italy, there is a great struggle about what they call classical and romantic, terms which were not subjects of classification, at least when I left it 4 or 5 years ago. Now, this was the trajectory of the word romantic. Now, let's come to romanticism. In 1824, the French Academy issued a decree denouncing romanticism in literature. Of course, by denouncing romanticism, It also ironically acknowledged its very existence. In his preface to Hernani, 1830, Victor Hugo defined Romanticism as liberalism in literature. In Salon de 1846, Charles Baudelaire declared that Romanticism is precisely situated neither in choice of subject nor in exact truth, but in a way of feeling. Now finally, how should we periodize Romanticism? Older histories of literature say that it was inaugurated with the publication of Lyrical Ballads in 1798 and ended with Byron's death in 1825. More often, however, the death of Walter Scott in 1832 is taken to mark the conclusion of this period. This is better than 1825 because it removes the exclusive focus on poetry as if it was the characteristic mode of writing of the time. Also, do remember that the characteristics of the Romantic movement differed from country to country. Romanticism is rarely spoken about without a qualifying adjective, British, English, French or German, to emphasize its national specificity. Now, if you want to read more on the issue of national specificity, see Romanticism in the National Context, which is edited by Roy Porter and published by Cambridge University Press in 1988. The issue of national specificity notwithstanding, the French Revolution was a point of reference common to all Romanticism. Therefore, now we are coming to, we just did the periodization, we did the issue of national specificity. Now we are coming to the definition of Romantic Revolution. The Romantic Revolution is therefore to be seen as a term used as a shorthand by critics and commentators to correspond with the French Revolution, Industrial Revolution and all the other revolutions that occurred during this period. But the Romantic Revolution was not so much a revolution of the state like these other revolutions we just talked about. It was a revolution of the self. It was more a revolution of the self, a revolution of ideas, a revolution against political, social and aristocratic norms of the age of enlightenment and a reaction against the scientific rationalism of nature. Also, given our discussion today, we need to see the idea of the rights of man, a byproduct of the French Revolution, as a circle with an ever-expanding circumference. We saw that the rights of slaves, the rights of children, the rights of women and even animals were brought under purview during this period. On how these changes seeped into literature and on how the dissolution of social hierarchies led to a literary democratization in terms of subject matter, genre, theme, language and characters. We will be tracing the literary background of the Romantic movement in our next session. Thank you for listening.